Hi, I'm Tony Perez with Opticos Design, and I'm here to take you through the fourth segment of our form-based code series here with the City of San Rafael. And today's session is about um, building form and placement standards. They're part of the segments that we've talked about earlier, and this 12 or 14-minute segment goes into a little more information about this particular part of form-based code. So thanks for joining us. So welcome back. Thank you for joining us today for this fourth session. And as you see on the screen here, there are a number of pages shown, and these are pages in a form-based code, the types of codes that we write. And you can see there are 4 pages that we're going to go through. The ones on the right um, and focus on the building form and placement standards today. So the building form and placement standards are super important because they they set the basis for the form and character to be delivered, and the form and character that came from your vision in a public process. What kind of a form and character does that vision expect? Either that it already exists and you're making more of it, or it doesn't exist and you're building from scratch. So the building form standards are important because they help not only form individual buildings, but they help form positive relationships between buildings and between buildings across the street and for shaping the street. So the first part of identifying building form and placement standards is to look at the intended physical character. And as we talked about last time in the previous segment, we talked about the physical character and uses in each zoning district, and we talked about how each of those zoning districts has its own distinct physical character, although it shares many of the same elements: buildings, streets, setbacks, streetscapes, um, all kinds of other elements. The difference between the numbers and the standards in each of those zoning districts is in response to the type of physical character that's intended. Bigger buildings and deeper buildings in one zone, maybe smaller buildings and bigger setbacks in another, and so on. So that information is carried forward into these standards, and we'll start with building size, footprint, and massing. And so these standards have to deal with uh, how how big and how deep does a lot have to be in a particular zoning district in order to accommodate the types of buildings and the range of buildings that are expected in that zoning district. And again, everything that's allowed slash expected, you can use the same term. It's all in the service of, or in the aim of, generating that intended physical character, or again, if it already exists, to make more of that physical character with every new investment. So building size, footprint, and massing are very um, very key to making sure that buildings just aren't the right height and the right intensity, but the right size. How wide, you can see on the screen here on the right, in addition to the lot width and lot depth requirements, um, which are typical in a lot of zoning codes, but they're more of a minimum rather than what really fits kind of approach. And in a form-based code, it's more about the fit. And so you can see their dimensions here for how wide buildings can be, how deep they can be from front to back, going from the front of the lot to the rear of the lot. And that all has a lot to do with the kinds of relationships that buildings have with one another, and then the occupants. What's it like to be in the backyard of these buildings if one of the buildings was too long front to back? So those kinds of standards can be put into into this section of the code. And then in addition, massing. So it's not enough to say height and width, you need to say, well, buildings wider than X and deeper than Y have additional requirements, and so you can put those here. Building placement and setbacks is next. Understanding how big buildings can be, now we can apply standards for where do they need to be on the lot in relation to the street and to the side street and to the side yards and rear yards. Where does the building need to be in order to make the environment that's expected and to make the streetscape that's expected? So this area of the code identifies not only building setbacks, but what we call a facade zone. And the facade zone is along the front of buildings and along the side streets of buildings, and so on corner lots. And the facade zone basically works to allow the designer creativity to not just have this relentless row of building facades, from one end of the block to the other, but to allow the building designer and the developer to have the building not just be in a straight line. They could have it in a straight line, but it gives the option to do other things as long as that facade is in this facade zone. And you can see it here in the interior lots and then here on the corner lot. And the idea is that if you place enough of the facade in that area, you're going to positively shape the streetscape every time you have a building. If you didn't put the building in there and you had a deeper setback than that, it might sound great from some type of mitigation standard approach, but it wouldn't be great for positively shaping a streetscape. The next part, let me just continue with that. You can see illustrated here, this type of environment is really dependent on larger front setbacks. And this environment has large front setbacks, but they didn't really have any standards for where the building could go versus the parking. And so this beautiful street that I was showing you, you can see a remnant up to the right, a beautiful house there with a front yard. It's been compromised by the standards not really knowing about the existing character. Same with this side street in a little village main street kind of context. The building is in the right place to form a main street environment. It needs to be near or at the sidewalk. And this is also a non-residential building, but the front isn't very clear, although the entrance, you can see it, has been designed well with that nice covered entrance. But there's a parking lot and really no place to speak of in terms of a public realm. It's a parking lot kind of realm rather than a streetscape public realm. So building placement and setbacks are very important. It's also related to what kind of a place are you making? Are you making a place like this, or are you making a place like that? And dependent on the answer to that question, the standards would correspond. Building height and ground floor height are also very key elements of this section of the code. It's not enough to say how tall buildings are allowed to be. It's more important, or equally important, to say how tall the ground floor needs to be in certain areas to maintain that character, either that exists or that you want to create. But it's also important to measure to the highest top plate. A lot of codes, or most codes, use the approach that height is bad, and certainly too much height in the wrong area, in the wrong situation, can be bad. But in neighborhoods and in Main Street areas, the best approach that we found is to measure to the highest top plate, or the highest eave, as is indicated here. And what that does is it makes sure that the building height up to that point produces realistic and useful floors, and it also doesn't result in people trying to squeeze the overall building down into the overall maximum height, as you've probably seen some pictures of buildings that look a little squatty, and that's usually because they're trying to comply with a height standard that doesn't recognize the needs of the building that is being designed, because height has been turned into a negative most of the time. But if you measure it in this way, it frees up the building to be effective and to be designed well and not appear squatty. parking placement, like I said in one of the earlier segments, there are so many good codes out there that do all the right things, get all the good standards in place, and then they're almost silent on parking location, parking placement. And so you get some good designs that are compromised by the parking being in the wrong place. So again, if you're trying to produce pedestrian oriented environments, the idea is to move those parking areas toward the back or toward at least the middle of lots and let the buildings occupy the front and the sides on corner lots. So as mundane as this can sound, it's very, very important to make this clear. And then lastly, the subject of massing standards. We touched on it early in the first part of this segment in the building form and placement standards. But sometimes, depending on adjacencies, you want to apply additional standards. So throughout the zone, the building form and placement standards would deal with massing, as I was mentioning. But there are certain cases where maybe let's say there's 200 lots in the zoning district, but 20 of them, for example, might be in an area where they're adjacent to much smaller buildings, or yeah, usually just much smaller buildings or different scale of buildings. Maybe they're narrower than the buildings that are in the zone that you're dealing with. And so this would be a place to recognize that without casting the standards over the entire zoning district, and simply recognizing those areas that need additional massing standards to better relate to the buildings that they're next to the buildings in another zone. So this allows you the ability, as you can see on the screen here, in the green, to either do additional step backs from the front or side streets on the corner lots, or in the rears, as you can see there in the blue, between buildings that are of different height but of similar scale, or you can see on the lower right hand side, where they're buildings of bigger scale, larger scale, that are presenting a rear to a neighboring, let's say, house or smaller building. So then you can see those blue areas being described in their width and height and depth. And this kind of approach lets you customize the standards further without burdening all the buildings in that zoning district with the same standard. So this concludes the building form and placement standards session, and I look forward to your questions and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.